Around the world, there are plenty of warship wrecks from the Second World War: battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and smaller craft. But there are some wrecks that are more interesting than others, particularly German wrecks. Of course, there are famous wrecks like that of the battleship Bismarck in the Atlantic or the Scharnhorst in the Arctic. But to me, those aren't the most interesting. The two most interesting wrecks are the Admiral Scheer, buried in Kiel, and the Prinz Eugen, partially above water in the Pacific. The last one, the Prinz Eugen, is extremely striking. Just looking at her, it begs the question, why is she there? And better yet, why is she still there? In today's video, we're going to discuss these wrecks and why they're still in their respective locations. First things first, we should probably discuss how these ships got to their final resting spots. In the spring of 1945, each ship was involved in the bombardment of advancing Soviet troops, where the Admiral Scheer, after having expended all of her ammunition, her gun barrels wearing thin, and having refugees on board, she headed to one of the only cities left in Germany that could service her, Kiel. Arriving on March 18th, where she went to the fitting out base in the Deutsche Werke near the cruisers Admiral Hipper and Emden. As I previously mentioned, by this time, Allied bombers were operating virtually unopposed in the air and were mainly threatened by scattered concentrations of anti-aircraft guns. To help in the defenses, the anti-aircraft guns and ammunition aboard the Admiral Scheer were taken off to hopefully provide for the defenses of the city and surrounding area. Unfortunately for the Admiral Scheer, her heavy armament was unserviceable because of the proposed barrel changeovers. B turret completed the exchange on the 8th of April, and because of the constant threat of air attacks, a proposal to bring the ship out into Heikendorf Bay was put forward on the 10th to have a floating crane assist in the exchange of turret barrels. So the following night, when bombers came overhead, a majority of the ship's company was off the ship. Gerhard Koop and Klaus-Peter Schmolke have this to say in their book, Pocket Battleships of the Deutschland Class, Warships of the Kriegsmarine. At 9:50 p.m. on the 9th of April, there was an air raid warning and most of the remaining crew went to bunkers ashore, leaving aboard 90 or so officers and men of the damage control parties. The first bombs began falling at 10:30, and the ship was first hit at 10:38 p.m. At 10:45, hits caused lighting and command relay systems to fail, and the cruiser assumed a list of 16 degrees to starboard. But power was restored long enough to get the ground vents open and make compensatory flooding to halt the list at 18 degrees. At just after 10:45, as consequence of further hits and near misses, the list increased quickly to 28 degrees. At which point, the engineer officer of the watch gave the command to leave the electrical plant running and gave the command to abandon the ship. The order did not reach all of the centers because of the electrical failures, although individual posts were abandoned as soon as the gravity of the situation became apparent. The remaining crew climbed through burning and smoke-filled rooms to reach companionways and portholes. Some crewmen were killed or injured by falling machinery and components. Despite the asphyxiating condition and their exhaustion, groups dragged injured and unconscious shipmates to safety, those not being able to swim the few strokes to the quayside being picked up in the water by small craft. Salvage workers from Emden cut into the hull in several places, and rescue teams scoured the upturned hull for 42 hours in the search for survivors. Having discharged her ammunition and fuel, Admiral Scheer was high out of the water and ballasted with a small amount of seawater in the double bottom. She capsized over a period of 12 to 17 minutes in 15 meters of water, the primary cause being the large gash on the starboard side caused by near misses. All 8 members of Damage Control Party 1 and 7 other crew members, including 3 engineer cadets, were left entombed in the mangled remains of the ship. That's how the Admiral Scheer ended up in Kiel. We'll pick up the rest of her story in a bit. Instead, we'll move over to the Prinz Eugen. How'd she end up in the Pacific? Well, after having participated in bombardments of advancing Soviet troop columns in the spring of 1945, she was in Copenhagen with the light cruiser Leipzig. After Hell had been evacuated and abandoned in mid-April, Prinz Eugen eventually retired to Copenhagen on April 19th, joining the light cruiser Nürnberg, where, to quote Aidan Dodson and Serena Kant in Spoils of War, the fate of the enemy fleets after 2 world wars. A considerable number of German vessels were in Danish waters at the time of the surrender, in particular, those involved in the Baltic evacuations. Considerable friction resulted when Danish elements attempted to board German vessels, the latter's crews not recognizing the Danes as victors, only the British, to whom they had formerly surrendered under the May 5th agreement. Apart from the big ships, the replenishment ship Nordmark, together with T-47, T-107, T-108, and T-151, and other smaller vessels, had been at Copenhagen on the 7th. On May 7th, both cruisers were taken over by the Royal Navy. In the coming days, the two ships were escorted to Wilhelmshaven by the cruisers Devonshire and Dido, arriving in the harbor locks on the 26th of May. Prinz Eugen was lodged in the 40,000-ton floating dock in the city, but since all of her ammunition had already been shipped at Copenhagen, little else remained to be done to the heavy cruiser. On June 2nd, after a final commander's parade, a large contingent of the crew was disembarked, and those remaining aboard were subjected to close watch. Nevertheless, many objects of traditional or historical value were smuggled off the ship. During this period of being laid up, the cruiser was visited by numerous high-ranking Royal Navy officers. It proved a magical attraction, especially for naval engineers of Western powers. The remains of the German fleet were to be divided amongst the victorious powers. For example, the cruiser Nürnberg and the gunnery target ship Hessen were eventually ceded to the Soviet Union. Prinz Eugen, on the other hand, was the creme de la creme of the remaining surface units, and everybody wanted her. The USSR, because of its attempts to purchase the vessel in 1939 and a sort of prize for the bombardment of its forces over the last year of the war, the British wanted her in part for her role in sinking HMS Hood, and the Americans wanted her for the technology, if that's to be believed. There are some sources that say the United States didn't even want the ship, and one of the only reasons to have her was to keep her away from the Soviets. After much debate on how to decide who got the ships, lots were drawn. The lots were Lot X, which was Prinz Eugen, one Type 1936A destroyer and 5 other destroyers/torpedo boats; Lot Y, which was Nürnberg, 4 Type 1936A destroyers, 6 other destroyers/torpedo boats; Lot Z, 8 Type 1936A destroyers, 5 other destroyers and torpedo boats. To take from Dodson Crank again, it was not until October 29th that the British were prepared to go ahead based on the luck of the draw. And later that day, the draw took place. To the consternation of the British and the Soviets, both keen to get Prinz Eugen, Lot X fell to the Americans. Lot Y went to the USSR, and Z to the UK. This result was enshrined in the final report of the TNC, signed December 6, 1945. The Americans won, and on December 14, 1945, Prinz Eugen arrived at Bremerhaven, then an American enclave within the British zone of occupation. On January 5, 1946, Prinz Eugen was commissioned into the United States Navy under the designation IX-300 to designate that she was a war prize, but retaining the name Prinz Eugen. She left German waters that day for Britain. To sail her there and for technical investigations of her machinery and other technologies, a large part of her German crew was retained and remustered aboard, particularly the weapons specialist, signal navigation specialist, underwater acoustic staff, and engine room staff. These were important because the Americans weren't well versed in the high-pressure hot steam plant. Dodson and Kant have this to say: although both Nagato and Sakawa sailed with U.S. crews, both did not get commissioned. However, Prinz Eugen was commissioned under her original name, and the hull number was IX-300. On January 5, 1946, with a composite American-German crew, she sailed from Wesemunde for Boston in January, arriving on the 22nd. The cruiser was examined on arrival, a number of her components being removed for trials and further analysis. Her passive sonar being installed in USS Flying Fish. The guns of the foremost turret were removed at Philadelphia in February, together with 2 105mm mountings, a set of torpedo tubes, light AA guns, and several rangefinders. As the quote mentioned, the cruiser arrived off the United States East Coast in late January, arriving in Boston on the 23rd and then on to Philadelphia, leaving on February 11th for the Panama Canal, which she transited on the 15th. Once she was in the Pacific, a comprehensive examination of the hydrophones was undertaken, and the cruiser called in San Pedro on March 24th. From April 10th to May 1st, the torpedoes were thoroughly investigated. When the German crew was no longer needed, they were taken back to Germany. Contingents of the German crew were disembarked in 3 groups, and on May 1st, Captain Reinecke and the remainder of the crew were landed on May 1st, 1946. The Americans subsequently had some serious problems with the cruiser's machinery. A breakdown of all but one boiler on the passage from San Diego to Hawaii. The cruiser was brought with tug assistance to Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands via Honolulu. She was headed there along with other captured vessels like the Japanese battleship Nagato, along with expendable American vessels for atomic testing. Now that we have an idea of how each vessel got to their respective resting places, let's discuss why they are still there, starting with the Admiral Scheer. The mangled remains of the Admiral Scheer and the other German vessels were captured in the devastated city of Kiel by the advancing British forces in early May 1945. Kiel was largely destroyed in World War II, especially the dock area, since this was a major port city for Germany and the Kriegsmarine. Where in this photo, you can see the Mainleia Bluma, the former Norwegian Olav Tryggvason, and a Type 21 U-boat. There are a number of photos taken of the Admiral Scheer, mostly taken by British authorities, like this one, which reveals two things. A really good view of the capsized warship with a prefabricated bow piece of a Type 21 U-boat in the foreground, and the valuable metals that could be salvaged from the warship. Or this photo where you can see the capsized warship in the ruined dockyard along with the bombed out city of Kiel in the background. The armor plate and propellers found on the ship contain metals that could be reused for other applications. So, under British authorities, work began breaking up the wreck in July 1945, where all valuable metals, gun houses, and turrets were removed before the bare torso of the ship was abandoned where she lay. It seems that she was broken up in a number of ways, being cut up with welding torches and the possible use of explosives. As the scrapping process got on its way, the ship moved slightly to allow for the scrappers to get to parts of the ship above the waterline that were now below. Much of the scrap metal went on to Britain to be processed, and by the following July, the scrapping had come to a completion because of the cost of further efforts to scrap her, as it would require the ship to be towed elsewhere to finish the job. So what was left of the Admiral Scheer, which were pieces of the hull, were left where they sat. By 1945, the reconstruction of Western Germany was beginning, and the principal Baltic naval base of the future and past German Navy was no exception. So when it came time to begin building the new naval arsenal, the remains of the mangled hull were covered over with rubble to become the foundations of a new large parking lot, with the ship's remains most likely being in this area. As for the crew that were entombed in the ship, I could not find a source that says they were removed from the ship. According to a 2023 survey from the Institute of Geosciences of Kiel University, which I'll place a link to the survey in the description so you all can go read it, the wreck was partially cleared after the war, with the bow removed up to the forward engineering spaces and the stern was removed to the beginning of the armor belt, with the remaining midship sections cleared down to the waterline and subsequently buried by sand and other debris in the early 1950s, as I mentioned before. Using photographs from after the time she capsized, and specifically this one from March 29, 1949, the research team used the surrounding buildings that are still there today to find an approximate location of the buried Admiral Scheer, and through the use of magnetic radiometry, ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic induction, and electrical resistivity tomography were used to help find the remains of the Admiral Scheer, which I can assure you, all of those are way above my head. The report concludes by stating the photo from March 29, 1949, represents the state which the Admiral Scheer was buried, where they claim large parts of the hull and superstructure have been preserved through being buried under 3 meters or about 10 feet of sand and debris. You should really go take a look at the paper, it's very interesting, and they have some of the models they made using the scans. Which are amazing. So basically, the ship remained in place because there was no point in moving her, and her remains were useful in rebuilding Kiel. An interesting end to that vessel. As for the Prinz Eugen, on July 1st, 1946, the first post-war atom bomb test was carried out on a group of 11 warships, including the heavy cruiser. Prinz Eugen proved resilient to the blast, and there was little damage aboard the ship, this being test-able, although all animals were killed aboard the vessel. To take from heavy cruisers of the Admiral Hipper class, warships of the Kriegsmarine by Gerhard Koop and Klaus-Peter Schmolke, they write, The second A device exploded on July 25th. Was an underwater bomb, Test Baker. The ship remained afloat, but was heavily irradiated. As a result, The intention to repair and recommission her was abandoned, and the hull was towed to Kwajalein Atoll and anchored. Because of the long period she spent in tropical waters, the stuffing glands and outboard vents of the ship began to leak. Attempts were made to beach the Prinz Eugen on Ennebuj Island in Kwajalein Lagoon, which ultimately failed when the ship grounded on a coral ledge just offshore. The ship continued to take on water and eventually capsized. Due to the radioactive contamination, not much could be done, and the ship was left where it was. The ship was resurveyed in the 70s and was found to be radiation-free, although the report noted that all ordnance still on board and residual fuel would need to be removed before salvage operations could be carried out. So again, nothing could be done. It did also note that fuel should be removed in the next 30 years, regardless of salvage operations. Several things were salvaged, notably the ship's bell and one of the two propellers. This was done by the German Navy League in 1979 and mounted in front of the Naval Memorial at Le Beau. Well, remember how I said fuel needed to be removed? It took until 2018 when a U.S. Navy-led salvage team from the Navy's Supervisor of Salvage and Diving successfully removed 229,000 gallons of fuel from 173 tanks on Prinz Eugen. Using a method called hot tapping, the fuel was pumped into a tanker for disposal and recycling. The tanks were then resealed so they could not leak again. But going back to the main question we asked at the beginning, the reason why she's still there is initially because of the damage and radioactivity, and subsequently a lack of money and interest. Today, the wreck is 80 years old, fragile, and not harmful to the environment. In fact, looking at some of these photos, I'd say she'd become part of the environment. So moving her just isn't feasible, so she'll just sit there with her final resting place being in the Pacific. There you have it, folks, why those German ships are still in their final resting places. I thought this would be a little different and fun. Let me know if you want me to do this for more wrecks. I think it could be a series. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have an amazing day.